So good morning. My name is Anto Budiarjo, and this is a webinar that we are holding to give a little bit of a debrief as to the development of the agenda for GridWeek that's coming up on October 2nd to 4th in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us this morning. We have been organizing GridWeek since 2007. So this is the sixth year that we're doing this conference. And to give a little bit of a backdrop to those unfamiliar with GridWeek, we started organizing GridWeek as an opportunity for all of the stakeholders involved with smart grid together once a year to discuss the critical issues that's facing the development and the evolution of smart grid. And we have executed 5 of these events in the past, and they have all sort of been focused on specific issues of the day. And this year is no different to that. So the way we organize GridWeek is that we work with a number of partner organizations, and I'm showing basically the website of GridWeek on GoToMeeting right now. I don't have any slides. We're just going to use the website to navigate through the agenda. You see on the screen there the what we call the major partners. These are the major entities that are involved with putting together GridWeek, and the advisory board. Many of them you'll hear from today on the webinar make up the advisory board that puts together this event every year. So if I can just explain a little bit of the process, the advisory board meet basically every month face-to-face, and more often than that by phone. And we started this year's activities, the planning of this year's event, back in December last year, January of this year. So it's been several months now that we've been working on the agenda and the structure of GridWeek 2012, and this is typical of how we've behaved in the past. The theme that we came up with for this year, and you'll see the tagline on the website, value achieved from complexity. And that actually went through a significant amount of discussion before we finalized on that theme. And there was a lot of debate as to whether we should really be focused on value or whether we should be focused on complexity and the whole dynamics of the two. And we decided to meld the two to actually have a target GridWeek to have to be a discussion platform for how we're actually extracting value from smart grid, which is fundamentally very complicated and very complex. And it's complex from a technology perspective, but also complex from a regulatory policy as well as business models. So that's how we've kind of are thinking about this year's event. If we go to the agenda, you see the agenda of GridWeek, which spans 3 days, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, October 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. And we've divided each of the days into a sort of a sub-theme. The sub-theme for Tuesday is extracting value. You'll see that in the keynote. It's all about extracting value. The sub-theme for Wednesday is taming complexity, which is again goes towards the whole issue of how we manage that complex system that is smart grid. And on Thursday we turn it around in terms of how we need to evolve what we want to call smart policies to move things forward in terms of taming complexity and extracting value. So you'll see here the 3 tracks that will run across the 3 days, and so for each of these tracks for each day, we have a track lead. And what we're going to do for the rest of this call is to actually go through each of those tracks to explain what is the sort of thinking behind each of these tracks directly from the advisory board that's responsible for each of these tracks. Because we're in the middle of August, quite a number of the track leaders are not here because they're vacationing or otherwise not able to be here. But most of the track leads are here. So we should be able to get quite a good sense of what the agenda looks like. And we'll start with the first track, which is called the big drivers for value, because for each of the three tracks are sort of divided into three kind of streams of discussions. One is to do with what we call big drivers, the sort of big issues that's facing us in the day with regards to energy and global issues. The second is the second track of each day focuses on utility discussion on utility context, and the third is focusing on what we call showcase, to actually see what is actually going on in each of those 3 days. So to kick this discussion off, I'm going to hand over to Paul Molitor, who is responsible for the big drivers for value on Tuesday. Hand it to you, Paul, to explain a little bit about the thinking behind this track. Paul? Are you there, Paul? Okay, Paul does not seem to be there. If I can move maybe to the value of utility business, which is Chris Eisenberg. Chris, are you there?
Yes, Anto. Thanks. Chris Eisenberg here from Edison Electric Institute. We're one of the organizing committee members. We represent the shareholder-owned electric utilities in doing advocacy work and here in Washington, D.C., amongst the federal agencies and state regulators and regulatory commissions. Our track that we manage is typically referred to as the utility track, and what we try to do is provide the perspective of what utilities are doing in the area of grid modernization, or as it's come to known as smart grid. So we've broken the, based off of the, this overall theme of GridWeek, we broke our track down into three key panels. Again, trying to provide the utility perspective and utility panelists, both domestic and international. The partners that I deal with on developing the content for this track and recruiting the various panelists are Capgemini and Enernex, the second and third tracks. I'll talk a little bit about those my track, which is the first track called New Revenue Streams for Utilities, and just briefly touch upon the other two tracks. The first track basically is the big picture track or big picture panel for the utility perspective. Basically, there's the understanding that the system beneath our feet and above our heads is changing. We're moving from central station generation, transmission lines, the traditional utility business model, to a new paradigm of distributed generation, electric vehicles, microgrids. And with all this coming on the grid, utilities have both challenges and opportunities. Challenges are more from an infrastructure point of view. How do we handle all of this technology and new applications coming onto the grid to continue to provide cheap and efficient and reliable electricity? On the other hand, utilities have a business model that has been around for decades, and there's this realization that this new paradigm and these new applications that are coming on the grid are going to challenge both the business model, but also provide some new opportunities for utilities to play a role in that space. Basically, we have a panel of 4 panelists and and the moderator. Moderator is David Owens from my organization, the Edison Electric Institute. He's Executive Vice President of Business Operations and Smart Grid and Grid Modernization and Operations, and PERC and NARUC and all those types of things fall under his leadership here at EEI. So he's going to moderate a panel that's broken up into four panelists. Matt Dinsmore from Altman Valandry is a consultant to utilities, and he's going to look at what the business opportunities for utilities are in the customer-facing aspect of the modern grid. Energy efficiency, energy usage, those types of things. Using peak demand, those types of areas. Then we're going to have a panelist from Dominion, one of our member companies, named Mary Doswell. She leads Dominion's new subsidiary called Dominion Voltage. Basically, they created this company out of what they saw coming out of smart meter data, and the fact that they could use the smart meter data to then create a whole new company, a subsidiary of Dominion that is looking at volt VAR control and those types of things on the T&D side to create value for the utility, which then translates to value for the customer. So it'll be interesting to hear from her, what was the thinking behind the creation of this new subsidiary? What did the data tell them that they decided this is an opportunity that they would like to pursue? Another panelist will be Rayford Smith, who leads Duke Energy, another member company of the EEI's, their Smart Grid Emerging Technology Group. And like Mary Doswell at Dominion, he's in charge of a group that's looking at all the business opportunities for Duke as the playing field starts to change with the modernization of the grid. Finally, every panel that we try to have, and Anto may have spoken about this earlier, but every panel that we try to have some kind of international experience, expertise or perspective coming on that. We've got another panelist named Jörg Lohr, who works for RWE in Germany, a large utility out in Germany, and his focus is on the electrification of transportation and what their company is doing from a business point of view as far as providing the infrastructure support and build out for electric vehicles. So it'll be very interesting to hear his perspective, not only from where he sits in Europe, but also just from the EV point of view from a utility. And we have 2 more panels. Second panel is going to be run by Capgemini and David Ducharme, who works for Capgemini. And the title of the panel is "The Journey Continues: Smart Meters to Distribution Automation." And basically, the point of this panel is that we're going to have 65 million smart meters on the grid within a couple of years. We've got 30-some million right now, and it's now time to start extracting that data that's coming from those smart meters and to put it to use from a grid optimization point of view. So he has a very good list of panelists right now. I'd say the person who is probably the headliner of that right now is Ahmad Faruqi. Many of you on the phone have read his work or followed his discussions on EEI's listserv, hopefully. So Ahmad will do a great job on that panel. And then we'll have Charles Dickerson from Pepco Holdings, who is right on the front lines about, on Pepco's work as they have rolled out hundreds of thousands of meters recently. In fact, I just got my smart meter about 3 weeks ago. So he's the guy who will be talking about their views from a business transformation point of view. And Donnie Helm is another panelist that we have confirmed, and he works for Encore Electric Delivery, which is another EEI member. So you can see that the theme here is a lot of electric utility perspectives. Final panel is called Analytics, Extracting Value out of the Data. And we're working closely with Doug Hausman from Enernex to develop that panel. That panel is a little slower in development than the other two, but I think once we have people confirmed, we're going to have a really good discussion for everyone to sit in for. So that kind of covers my track, and look forward to any questions at the end.
Okay, so you do have on the GoToMeeting tool a mechanism to ask some questions. So if you do have any questions, please use that tool, and we'll address them either during the presentations or at the end as is appropriate. So I don't know, Paul, if Paul Molitor, if you're online at all.
Yeah, my cell phone is showing connected. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. Technical difficulties. All right, well, hello, everybody. Good morning, and my name is Paul Molitor. I'm with the National Electrical Manufacturers Association, NEMA, and we are proud to have been a member of the GridWeek organizing committee and a participant in GridWeek since the beginning. So it's a very important part of our strategy every year, and I'll cover the items here on my track, which are at the top of that row. The whole idea of extracting value. And so if you take a look, the first thing, the big drivers, I should say, the big drivers in smart grid. And the first session that we have is the idea of smart grid in the military. If you take a look at the DoD, they are really between a rock and a hard place because they have a lot of DoD mandates coming out in terms of energy security that they have to meet, and the way that they're trying to accomplish that is through implementing smart grid technologies on installations. And so we've lined this panel up to really talk about the drivers that the military is having, the influences that they're having in terms of moving the entire smart grid community forward, and how bases are leading that effort. For the next session that we have there in terms of nurturing the smart grid ecosystem, that session it's really focusing on the fact that all of us in the industry are having to work together and cooperate and collaborate in ways that we really haven't in the past. And so the SGIP has been a great forum for that, and what we're focusing on in this session is the whole idea of you know, how we all just get along, how we continue to move this forward, how we move technologies together to everyone's benefit, utilities, manufacturers, software providers, the security, all of it. So the whole idea of nurturing that ecosystem and how everybody extracts their value from that. And then the last panel that we have is the notion of the global smart grid and energy security. And what we're focusing on there, again, if you take a look at the statements that NIST made about smart grid when they were developing their framework and roadmap document, is that they wanted to prefer international standards. And so in addition to that, what we see within the smart grid interoperability panel is that they have several MOUs with other countries, and we're seeing really a global community that's working on this smart grid effort. So the whole idea of the laws of physics don't change as you go from country to country, and the idea is that how we're benefiting from everybody else's experience in terms of that. So it's kind of like nurturing that smart grid ecosystem, but on a global basis. So there can be some similarities there, but it'll actually be more focused on what's happening internationally. And so that's really kind of the philosophy behind those three sessions. We've got, you'll see some of the photographs, some of the names we've identified. We're working on confirming some of the speakers. I'm probably not as far along as Chris is, but at least you get a hint for what it is that we're trying to accomplish with this track. And like Chris, I look forward to your questions at the end of the session.
Thank you, Paul. If we continue to the third session, sorry, the third track on Tuesday, which is all around the sort of showcase of what we say, what we're calling showcase of delivered value. This is being led by Tony Thomas from NRECA. Unfortunately, he's unable to be with us today, so I'm going to take his place. There are three sessions in this track, all really designed to sort of showcase what is actually going on in the industry right now in terms of extracting value out of all of this smart grid activities. The first one really relates back to what Paul just mentioned, and it's all related to the whole standards activities that's been going on. Obviously, a lot of that relates to the SGIP work, which is being led by George Arnold. So he is moderating this panel. He's leading and moderating this panel. And it's really about how standards are critical from a value perspective, and how standards, if implemented correctly, becomes what we want to call a value multiplier. It actually increases the value of all of the technology and the activities that's going on in the smart grid. So I think that's going to be a really instructive discussion about really not really about the standards themselves, but how people should be looking at adopting standards and actually relying on standards in many parts of deployment of a smart grid. The second session is totally focused on microgrids, and specifically microgrids both in the developed countries, predominantly sort of US experiences of microgrid deployment, and also a lot of microgrid work that's going on in developing countries. Terry Moan, who is leading this session, is doing a lot of work with the UN in deploying or implementing energy strategies around the world in Africa and Asia. So he's got a lot of perspectives about how microgrid fits into those sort of models. So it's kind of a comparison about how we look at microgrid in developing countries and how other people are looking at it in other parts of the world. And the third session on this is totally focused on transmission, and specifically about the value of dynamic transmission and the implementation of technologies in those areas. The session is being moderated by Sandy from Nexans, and this is going to be quite an instructive panel discussion on this on transmission. So that's the showcase for delivered value on Tuesday, and that makes up the third and last session, the last track on the Tuesday of GridWeek. So we now move on to Wednesday, and the first is what we call drivers to tame complexity. So again, the theme, the sub-theme for Wednesday is how to tame complexity, the sort of complex beast that we're trying to work with in the way of smart grid. So the first one is the drivers, the sort of the big drivers, and for this, Dean Prohaska from NIST is leading the whole track. Dean is not able to be with us, but Koen Nguyen from NIST is here to take his place. So I'm going to hand over to Koen to explain a little bit about the sessions in this track. Koen, over to you.
Thank you, Anto. Good morning. This is Koen Nguyen from NIST. And like what Anto said, Dean Prohaska and myself are working on this track together. And this whole track is on big driver to tame complexity. So like Anto had mentioned earlier on, the smart grid is a pretty highly complex system. So our thinking is that when you deal with a complex system or problem, you probably want to divide and conquer, and just look at it as a smaller chunk and solve those. So, and from that, we thought that there are some driver that can actually accelerate the evolution and development of technology to meet needs and requirements. So in this track, we're looking at 3 sessions that will more or less showcase different drivers that can enable development and deployment. So the first session is on the power of a well-coordinated initiative. In this session, we want to look at past example of successful initiative, not just the initiative itself, but how they were created and executed, and where we can actually learn from those that will help to make new initiatives that are successful. So if any initiative kind of have some commonality of how they are being created and executed, such as you need a well-defined problem, you need to have motivation to solve it, available technology to do it, a champion to lead the effort, and then a mechanism for industry to work together. So that's kind of the basis for looking at the initiative, and we are thinking about looking at some potential successful initiative in the past, including the Green Button, Energy Star, and such. And also, we also wanted to look at an international initiative as well. We wanted to look at different type of initiatives that cover both, something that originate from the federal side, something from the state, something from the community level, and then something that are cross-border. So those are the type of initiative that we want to look at, because they're very wide-ranging type of initiative that can be created and executed. So that's, and we are not as far along as confirming speaker yet. So we're going to work hard on that. And the next one is on transportation and renewable as driver, and this one is being led by Matt Wakefield of EPRI, and he's actually done a nice job of lining up speaker and moderator for it. And in this one, the whole idea is that both transportation as far as electric vehicle and plug-in electric vehicle and renewables such as wind and solar are driver, because if they have any big mass penetration, the technology would have to evolve in order to accommodate these. So with the more adoption of these technology, they can actually drive the development of technology, to handle it both on the distribution and transmission side of the grid. So they are. We actually will look at how utilities and vendors are dealing with, on the utility side, how to handle these penetration, and on the vendor side, how they are creating solution to manage these drivers. And the last panel is actually on smart city, gas, water, and critical infrastructure. So if you look at the whole effort, with NIST and the SGIP in general, we've been more or less focused on the electric grid, but there are a commonality and also intersection with other critical infrastructure like gas and water, and also outside the U.S. They are looking at the whole picture as a smart city per se, and not just the grid alone. So we thought that this would be a nice showcase to learn from different effort and how we can leverage it, and not reinventing the wheel, but leverage things that are being done in certain sector, and then have a coordinated effort. So and then this one is we actually just lined up a moderator, Johanna Parton from the C40 initiative. C40 is the whole kind of like smart city initiative that are looking at the being green and things like that. So this should be a pretty nice showcase, and we're trying to also look at if we can bring on the different city of Winton C40 to showcase their work. So with that, back to you, Anto.
Thank you, Koen. I think that's going to be a really interesting set of panels on Wednesday. So moving on to the taming utility complexity, which is being put together and being led the track by Mike Oldak with UTC. So hand it over to you, Mike, to give a brief overview of this track and why we're doing it. Mike, are you there?
Thank you, Anto. I'm having a hard time getting. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Anto?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Trying to figure out which button to press to get live again. Thank you very much. I think this is going to be an exciting panel. I think we are moving from a very one-way view of the utility industry, from large central station generators and large transmission lines all the way down to consumers, to a pretty complex network of distributed energy resources and intelligence at the edge of the grid. And I think this grid modernization and having smart appliances that can respond to pricing and emergency situations is going to be just part of everyday life in the future for utilities. And I think they're uniquely positioned to handle that responsibility. But I think along with that, and I think what this track is focused on, is how do we tame all this complexity? How do we get it all to work together? And our first panel looks at the changing face of energy demand. And I've called this demand efficiency, and others have called it demand optimization. But really, it's looking at how we integrate demand response, into everything we do. I think we've done an incredible job of increasing the energy efficiency in this country and giving customers what they want with fewer kilowatt hours. But in some parts of the industry, I think we're getting diminishing returns. I have a new refrigerator that cost me $55 a year to operate. How much more do I want to spend for a refrigerator to make it more efficient and reduce that $55 a year cost? So we're looking at, and I think the HVAC industry and the smart appliance industries and everybody are looking at ways that we can make appliances and everything we use not only more efficient but smarter, so that refrigerator, which each of them has a 500 or 600 watt defroster, will come on in the middle of the night rather than on during the peak of the day. And I think that part of this panel today looks at, the first panel, the changing face of demand, of energy demand, looks at how we integrate all these appliances and other applications into the utility business structure. The second panel looks at business and regulatory challenges for utilities. And I think, we started a lot of the smart grid because I remember back in '88 when we were looking at the reliability maps, almost 2/3 of the country was at or soon to be below reserve margins. And a lot of the value of smart grid was in helping engaging consumers to help utilities avoid or at least defer hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of infrastructure investments, and in some cases helping them get through some of the tight periods with the existing resources they had. The recession has, to a certain extent, had a somewhat silver lining in relieving some of the pressure on the need to increase new capacity. But I think there are a lot of other reasons why utilities need to modernize. And I think this panel looks at the business and regulatory challenges that utilities are facing in getting approval for the smart grid. And the third panel deals with sort of the big elephant in the room, cybersecurity and risk management. As we become more dependent on communicating among the utilities and customer devices, we're to a certain extent opening ourselves up to cybersecurity and risks. This panel looks specifically at that new relationship of and the new views that utilities are having on the importance of cybersecurity, what we're doing, what we can do, and what risks that we face, and how do we manage these risks so that we can ensure that if we are attacked and that there is a problem with the grid, that the grid will be resilient and be able to be restored quickly and efficiently. Anto, that's a quick and dirty.
Thank you.
I guess somebody thought it was so great they fell over, but that's
Thank you, Mike. So that's the second track on Wednesday, and the last track on Wednesday is in the showcase kind of context in the and this is being put together and managed by Eric Gunter, who's unable to be with us today. He's probably on an airplane like most days. So here again, we're talking about how to showcase, how to talk about what's actually going on in the industry, under the theme of taming complexity. So there are the three tracks as in the other sessions. The first one is really understanding what's going on in terms of thinking about the grid as a system of systems. That goes to obviously the complexity of the grid. It's not a single system, it's actually multiple systems that's being interlinked with interoperable standards, hopefully, and to make it all work for the benefit of all of the stakeholders. So as a discussion. And we're actually going to have two of the key speakers will be somebody from Germany, that is Ludwig Karg, who's been involved with a project in Germany called E-Energy, which is a research project and a pilot project looking at this whole sort of system of systems. And the second speaker is Ron Melton, and he will be talking specifically about the Northwest Smart Grid project that he, as part of PNNL and Bonneville Power, has been putting together. The second session is on managing cybersecurity and privacy. So there's a little bit of a difference between this and what Mike was talking about. Mike's really discussion is really about the risk management side of it, and specifically for utilities. Here we're really talking about what's actually going on, what's being implemented in terms of cybersecurity and dealing with privacy issues. And that's going to be led by Mike Amadi, and I think that's going to be a very interesting session. The third session is just to remind everybody that we're doing all of this, and the grid, the fundamental objective of the grid is to provide electricity and to make sure that we do that reliability. It is job number one. So it's really a discussion about making sure that in the all of the work we're doing in smart grid, that we don't forget the key mission of actually putting together a system that delivers power reliably. And that's basically the showcase in Taming Complexity on Wednesday. So if we now move to Thursday, first talk about the drivers for what we call smart policy. And I'm going to unmute Ivy. Ivy from NARUC, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Would you care to just give this track's being led by Miriam Horn, who is not able to be here because she just broke her wrist, which is not a good thing at all. But we have one of the individuals putting together one of the key sessions of this track, which is Ivy Wheeler from NARUC. So hand it over to you, Ivy, to explain a little bit about this Smart State and Regulatory Compact.
Sure. Thank you, Anto. Hello, everyone. This track is attempting to keep the conversation going between state and federal agencies so that they can work together to promote the smart grid policies. I'm working with moderator Sabine Kelly, who's a former FERC commissioner as well as a Public Service Commissioner of New Mexico. She's currently a partner at Patton Boggs and represents clients in all areas of the energy industry. And we're working to recruit regulators on both the state and federal side to share success stories and best practices on smart grid policy implementation. I recently received confirmation that FERC Commissioner John Norris will be able to join us. He lists one of his top initiatives as the smart grid. One of NARUC's smart grid working group members, South Carolina Commissioner Elizabeth Fleming, is able to join us, as well as former California Commissioner Nancy Ryan. I have also received a few tentative acceptances, one from Becky Harrison of Progress Energy. At our NARUC summer meetings 2 weeks ago, I spoke with both former Commissioner of the Colorado PUC, Ron Binns, and he agreed to join us, as well as Paul Centinella, which is the former Ohio Commissioner, also a smart grid expert and someone who recently took a job at the Analysis Group. I have also extended an invitation to Dr. Pramod Dio from the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission in India. However, I have not heard back from him, and I think things are probably kind of stressful in India right now. Additionally, I've been in conversations with Miriam, who is the overall track lead, about inviting Dawn Finnegan from the Environmental Defense Fund. So I have a lot of panelists currently, and looking forward to a great discussion. Any questions?
There are no questions posed on the questions tool. So again, to reminder to everybody, if you have any questions, just post them out there, please. Thank you, Ivy. It's great to have NERWIC part of this event. Indeed, for the last few years, they have been very active. The other two sessions in this track on the drivers for smart policy, the second session is all about the smart grid sort of role in relationship to the air quality requirements, the new air quality requirements. And we are working right now to secure somebody from EPA. And Susan Turney is from the analysis group that will be moderating the session, and we also have Jamie Fine from EDF involved in this track as well. So I think that's another sort of issue that there's keys that we can't ignore. The other, the third session is another issue that we can't ignore, is strictly about privacy. And here we're really talking about how we're really should be thinking about privacy in these days where sort of the rules of privacy seems to be being sort of rewritten every day by Facebook and Google and other sort of players in the information space. So it's not the same privacy issues that we would have faced in the last few decades. So how do we think about privacy in this sort of new context? That's really going to be a discussion that's going to be very interesting because we obviously need to move things forward in terms of our thinking and privacy in the smart grid. So that is the drivers for smart policy. If we moved on to the next track, which is smart policy for utilities. This is being put together by Drew Bennett from the Department of Commerce ITA, who is unfortunately traveling overseas today. There are two sessions here. One is on really gas, renewables, and the future energy systems. So I think everybody knows in this sort of energy space that natural gas is changing the scope of energy supply, and as well as renewables. And what is that going to do to this big picture, and how can smart grid play a role in that sort of transition in the next few decades? The second session, there are only two sessions in this track, is on international utility policy. Chris Hickman is working with a number of international players to bring them to this panel discussion. The speaker that's listed there, Irina Volkova from Russia, we'll be talking from obviously a Russia perspective, but we're also working on a number of speakers from the Middle East and elsewhere to have a discussion about policy issues. And this is a good time to also remind everybody that there is a significant international component to GridWeek this year through our partnership with the Department of Commerce, the International Trade Administration, as part of a program they call the International Buyers Program. And that's where sort of Andrew Bennett fits in, as well as his colleagues in the ITA organization. And one of the objectives, I think Paul mentioned earlier, is to have an international speaker in all of the sessions where appropriate, in addition to having utility speakers in all of the sessions and GridWeek. And so far we've got that. Both of those should be able to be met in terms of objectives. So that's the second track on Thursday, and the very last track on Thursday is Smart Policy Showcase, which I'm putting together. Here there are three sessions. The first session is on Green Button. I think we all know a lot about Green Button. We've heard a lot in the last few months about Green Button. Green Button was obviously the initial challenge that was laid out by Anish Chopra was done at GridWeek last year. So this session here, this panel, is designed to have a little bit of an update as to where Green Button is and where it's headed. And we will have somebody from the White House OSTP, Nick Sinai, that will be there. as well as from NIST, utility by way of Donny Helm, and also one of the at least one of the developers that's actually developed green button apps. So I think this would be a very interesting panel discussion to see what is next for green button, because we're not there yet. The second session is on consumer engagement through social media. This kind of relates to the privacy issue we talked about, I mentioned earlier, but here is really about the consumer engagement. There's a lot of social media changes going on in terms of how we look at the world, and how is that affecting how utilities and other energy players engage with consumers. And that's being put together by the Smart Grid Consumer Collaborative, being moderated by Patty Durant. And the very last session is on automated demand response. And this session is going to be put together by Barry Hasser. Barry is the executive director of the Open ADR Alliance, and they are working to put together this session to talk about what's actually going on in terms of the implementation of open and automated demand response currently with the new standards that they are working on. So that's a very quick run through on all of the 9 sessions. So if I go back to the agenda, big broad agenda, we are still working on the keynotes and roundtables, but the keynotes and roundtables are all going to be very linked to the themes of each of the days. So the keynote on Tuesday will be talking about extracting value, and we actually have I'll let Chris talk about that in terms of the Tom Graham. Chris Eisenberg, are you still there?
Yes. Thanks again, Anto. As you know, the event is being held here in Washington, D.C., and Pepco Holdings, and the local utility, Pepco in D.C., is the host utility. So we thought it would be appropriate to have Tom Graham, who is the president of the D.C. utility here under Pepco Holdings, to somewhat welcome but also provide his perspective of how smart grid, smart meters are helping his customers and his organization as a whole. As everyone knows or may have heard, here on the East Coast we had a major storm back in late June, early July that left millions of people on the East Coast without power. But it could have been significantly worse as far from a power outage response point of view or recovery point of view. Pepco was fortunate to have many meters out in the field operating, sending data back, and they were able to see the value from Smart Grid firsthand during that storm, where they were able to, I think the number was, close out about 3,000 work orders of people sending crews out to find out where the outages were taking place without even having to do so, because the meters were giving them data that told them that the outages were taken care of or were not as widespread in certain areas. So he saw, and his company saw, the value of the data and value of Smart Grid firsthand just a couple months ago, and I'm sure he'll touch a little bit about that as somewhat of a case study from their point of view.
Okay, thank you. So, and there'll be a roundtable again following on that. This particular roundtable is going to be moderated by Ahmed Faruqi from the Brattle Group. I think this is going to be a very interesting roundtable at the plenary session on Tuesday to have a discussion about extracting value. And on Wednesday, the Taming Complexity keynote we're still working on. There are a few people that we're discussing with to get involved with the event on Wednesday. And the Taming Complexity, we have a number of speakers that we're in the process of confirming right now, but this will be moderated by Paul DiMartini. Paul DiMartini used to be with Southern California Edison and subsequently went to work for Cisco and is now managing his own consultancy group called Newport Consulting Group. He has very extensive understanding of this whole issue and specifically on the complexity of this whole smart grid subject. So I think this is going to be a fascinating um, roundtable on the plenary of Wednesday. And on Thursday, we have on the smart policy side of things, we've just recently received confirmation from David Sandlow, the Undersecretary for Department of Energy, to provide a keynote talk in the morning of Thursday. So we're really very excited about that. David Sandlow is very well regarded in the energy space. He is also the Assistant Secretary responsible for policy and international affairs at the Department of Energy. So that's going to feed into this whole international flavor that we have. And the roundtable on Thursday is being moderated by Lee Cravat from San Diego Gas and Electric. Those of you that know Lee know that he's very passionate about this subject of smart grid. We're just working with him right now to populate this roundtable to have a discussion about smart policy. So being a utility, I think he's going to provide a really good perspective on this discussion. So that really rounds up the agenda. We are very excited about this agenda this year. I think we've touched on a number of the sort of key issues around value and around complexity and policy that are really important, and we're doing that in sort of three levels. One of the sort of big picture driving, the big issues driving things forward, and the second being the sort of utility perspective, and third being the sort of showcase side, showing what's actually going on. So please do post your questions or raise your hand in the tool. And since we do have some time before the end of the meeting, why don't I open it up to the panelists, the track leads that may want to add some more to the discussion. Chris, Paul, Mike, Kuhn, or others? Anything you think that we've missed in terms of explaining what's going on here?
Well, this is Chris Eisenberg. I would say, as Paul Molitor mentioned earlier, EEI, like NEMA, have been involved in GridWeek since the beginning, and I think this is the year where the rubber is meeting the road. We've had a couple years of where we had the investment grants, and we had talking about smart grid as a destination that we eventually get to. And I think that this is the year, this past year and going forward, is you're going to really see where the value is being extracted from all the investments that utilities and our partners are making. So it's an exciting time for the industry, and I think GridWeek will showcase that.
That's a great point, Chris. Glad that you raised that. And that really came out in the discussions that we've been having in the advisory board since January. I think it probably didn't jump out at first, but we kept on sort of asking ourselves what's going on in the industry, and it does seem that right now there's kind of almost sort of a watershed moment in smart grid. It's almost like the end of the beginning, and we're getting into a different phase of smart grid, and this agenda reflects that. And as Chris said, another way of looking at that is sort of where the rubber meets the road to actually make all of these things happen. Any other comments from the other track leads? So, Paul, do you have any sort of additional comments before we wind this webinar to a close? Are you there, Paul? Having problems again.
Anto, this is Mike.
Go ahead, Mike.
I think I support what Chris has said, that the pathway through smart grid to a certain extent has been one of policies and one of getting this accepted by state commissions, and to a certain extent, we've all considered smart meters as sort of the tip of the iceberg. Now we're taking a look at the rest of the smart grid, and I think that what we're looking at in this year's GridWeek will really, I think, be an eye-opener for a lot of people, and really explain sort of the tremendous value that we all see in not only smart meters, but really the data and the analytics and the interconnections and everything that will be I guess the future view of what utilities will be looking like and what they will be doing.
The other thing, just to remind us again, is this whole international perspective. There's obviously been enormous amount of activity going on in the US, and we're kind of almost in a heads down and getting stuff done mode in the US. The picture internationally is very different, and there are sort of hotspots of activities going on in smart grid. Brazil, for example, is a significant space that we're actually working with the ITA and to get delegations and speakers from there right now. A lot of activities going on in Europe and UK specifically, planning rollout of smart meters. And somebody mentioned earlier the issue that India had last year. Now, we were fortunate that we had the opportunity earlier this year in January to organize a GridWeek Asia in India. So we have a significant relationship with many of the players there, and we're actually trying to see if we can put together a delegation from India to come to GridWeek, and talking to a number of people in that context to do that. Obviously, as somebody mentioned, they have their hands full right now. So it may be difficult to do that, but it may well provide an opportunity to have a good discussion about how smart grid can help in the sort of tool set to avoid cascading blackouts that they had that affected 600 million consumers, which is obviously very significant. So there's a lot of international perspective that we hope that we can bring into this discussion, and doing so would provide some interesting learning experience both for US and for international players to learn about what's happening around the world and how we can learn from each other the different sort of issues that's facing smart grid. So we're nearly at the top of the hour. So just open it up to one last opportunity for anyone to make any closing comments from the track leads. So with that, I thank you for being on this webinar. We will have another webinar in September, just a last sort of update before we actually execute the event at the beginning of October. So thank you very much for being here with us this morning, and we look forward to seeing you at